right, it's good to be here this afternoon, and excited to see good to see all the excitement this conference has generated. I'm going to read part of my paper, and I'm at the summarized part of it because it's far too long for me to include everything that I'd like to cover here. But hopefully, I'll get at least across to you some of the main points that I want to make here. So I'll begin by reading and then summarize a little bit later on. With the publication of the Book of Mormon in the spring of 1830 and Joseph Smith's claims to divine revelation that brought forth new and often unique teachings foreign to traditional interpretations of the Bible or established Christianity, there have been numerous attempts to uncover the sources behind such material. Since many have thought from the outset that more naturalistic explanations must surely account for them, all kinds of sources at one time or another have been marshaled to account for one peculiarity or another in Joseph's works and thought. In fact, one might say that a kind of general source criticism has almost emerged in the field that sought to bring to light, or in the hostile treatments expose, the putative sources Joseph drew upon. More recently, several writers have suggested that one source that may have influenced Joseph, especially with respect to his extra-biblical writings like the JST, Book of Moses, Book of Abraham, and even the Book of Mormon, is the first-century Jewish historian and apologist Flavius Josephus. While the suggestion has been made on a number of different occasions, it has never been rigorously pursued or investigated. To this end, the present paper seeks to thoroughly consider the potential influence the writings of Josephus could have had on Joseph Smith, and whether or not they may have left any discernible influence on the later's writings or thought. As a necessary preamble, a few words need to be said about Josephus and the scope and nature of the present analysis. Josephus, known by his trianomina, Titus Flavius Josephus, was born in AD 37 and died sometime circa AD 100 in Rome. A Jewish priest descended from the Hasmonean dynasty, Josephus is best remembered for his 4 surviving works that proved enormously popular among Christians for the next 1900 years: The Jewish War, The Jewish Antiquities, The Life and Against Apion. His first 2 works, Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities, have proved to be the most influential, since in them he recounts Jewish history of his own time, as well as in previous ages, and includes a number of stories and sources hitherto unknown. In particular, in his Jewish Antiquities, which contains 20 books, he determines to recount the history of the Jewish people from the beginning up to the present, i.e. the end of the 1st century. And in the first 11 books basically retells the biblical narrative contained in the Old Testament from Genesis through Ezra and Nehemiah. Josephus promises at the outset of this text that in his retelling of the biblical narrative, he would not so much as depart from any detail in the slightest, and that he would with fidelity and accuracy retell the whole biblical story. No sooner does Josephus begin the work than he immediately begins to depart from the biblical narrative in a number of ways. At times he adds numerous details not found in the Bible, and other times changes the story so drastically from the biblical account that they are hardly recognizable. Furthermore, he will even add entire stories which have no biblical precedent at all, or at other times excise passages as though they never belonged in the biblical account. This initial description of Josephus' handling of the biblical text in his Jewish Antiquities ought to call to mind some of Joseph Smith's biblical revisions, where he either added, omitted, or otherwise altered select passages. The biblical territory most ripe for comparison between Josephus' and Joseph Smith's alterations comprises the book of Genesis, and to a lesser extent Exodus through Deuteronomy. The reason Genesis offers especially fertile ground is because while Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible spanned the entire Old Testament, his JST emendations are most pronounced in Genesis. And additionally, we also have added to this, the Book of Moses and the Book of Abraham. After Genesis, one may note that as a whole, the JST alterations are less numerous and less pronounced. While the JST of Isaiah and Psalms represents an exception, Josephus includes very little information from either book in the Jewish Antiquities, since he's most concerned with retelling biblical narrative. Though the name Josephus may seem foreign to many people today, even to persons well-churched, between the 16th and early 20th century in England, Europe, and colonial and early Republic America, the works of Josephus were second in popularity only to the Bible itself. If Puritans arriving in New England brought with them any book beside the Bible, it was Josephus. And in fact, among the Puritans, it was the only book aside from the Bible that was permitted to be read on the Lord's Day. Interestingly, it was the second book of Jewish authorship, after the Bible, of course, to be published in colonial America in 1722. And it was among the initial 40 volumes contributed by the clergyman who founded the Collegiate School of Connecticut in 1701, now Yale University. For most persons of the time, their engagement with Josephus was not via the original Greek text or Latin translation, but were entirely dependent on the English translation of the day. The first English translation of Josephus to appear was in 1602 by Thomas Lodge. Enormously popular in the 17th century, this translation underwent multiple reeditions, with a new edition being printed about every decade. In 1692, another English translation was produced by Sir Robert Lestrange, and by the end of the following century, between 1773 and 1775, it had begun to circulate in America as it was published in New York and Philadelphia. However, by far the most popular and enduring English edition of Josephus was printed in 1737 and was translated by William Whiston. Whiston, a professor of mathematics at Cambridge and successor of Newton, was also a gifted linguist who had a keen interest in theology and church history. In December of 1734, at the ripe old age of 67, Whiston began translating Josephus, and remarkably by January the following year had completed the entire project, meaning 1736. Published under the title The Genuine Works of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish Historian, Whiston's translation immediately won widespread acceptance as the quote-unquote received text of Josephus, since the translation boasted on the title page that it had been translated from the original Greek instead of Latin or French, and Whiston guaranteed in the preface that Josephus' testimony of Jesus was authentic. As a result, Whiston's translation was thought by many to be tantamount to sacred scripture and a natural companion to the King James Version of the Bible, as there have been no less than 217 reprintings of Whiston's translation of Josephus since 1737, a rate of about one every 1.25 years. One can readily see the enduring popularity of this translation. Given the popularity of Whiston's edition, it is no surprise that by the later part of the 18th century, this was the most common English translation of Josephus in circulation in America. For example, the personal copy of Josephus owned by Hiram Smith was the 1830 imprint of Whiston. As one begins to zero in directly on Joseph Smith and possible points of contact with Josephus, it becomes evident that, contextually speaking, Joseph could have had direct access to the writings of Josephus very early on. It may be noted here that in the Manchester Rental Library, formerly established between 1815 and 1817, and located within 5 miles of the Smith family farm in Palmyra, possessed a copy of Whiston's 6-volume 1806 edition of Josephus. Furthermore, from newspaper advertisements from Palmyra during the 1820s and 1830s, it is evident that copies of Josephus were periodically advertised for sale in the local bookshops. Jumping ahead to the foundation of the church's first library in Nauvoo, established in the early 1840s, a catalog of sorts exists for the books that were donated by different church members. While Joseph Smith's personal donations did not include the works of Josephus, a number of members did donate personal copies of Josephus. And depending on how the titles in the catalog are interpreted, the works of Josephus may have been the most popular book in the library. Turning to early Mormon literature, Josephus is first invoked primarily in the church's newspapers, and in the earliest references is typically employed to help buttress claims unique to early Mormonism. What you have here, for example, in the Evening and Morning Star, Josephus is cited because apparently he reports that Jews kept important records on metal plates. And so this is why this comes up in the Evening and Morning Star in December 1832. Or in the Elder's Journal in November of 1837, Josephus is cited because he describes what the Urim and Thummim looked like. And so a comparison is then made there with what Joseph Smith describes the Urim and Thummim. What's interesting, though, and I was only able to find this out with the aid of Google Books, is in fact, while it may appear that saints are paying a lot of attention to Josephus, in fact, they're coming to Josephus via secondary material. In fact, as I began searching, it became very clear they're not reading Josephus, but reading a Bible dictionary about Josephus, or a history about Josephus, or a history of the Jews that mentions Josephus, and they're actually quoting this material more often than not. Turning now to Joseph Smith, I have found 3 direct references showing that he was acquainted with the works of Josephus. The first, which will be treated in more detail later in the paper, comes from the Journal of George Laub in an entry dated April 13, 1843. On this day, Laub commented that in a long sermon given by Joseph that touched on different aspects of Genesis, he made a reference to Josephus when discussing the giants that appeared in the days of Noah. The next reference comes from later in the year in a letter addressed to James Arlington Bennett, dated November 13, 1843, and published in November 1843 edition of the Times and Seasons. In this letter, wherein Joseph tried to impress Bennett with his language skills and knowledge of various ancient authors, which you know now was written by W.W. Phelps, he makes a passing reference to Josephus among other ancient writers. The third and final reference comes from Joseph's time in Carthage jail in June of 1844. According to an account given by Willard Richards, and preserved in the history of the church, on the fateful day of June 27th, 1844, Hyrum Smith read extracts of Josephus to Joseph, John Taylor, and Willard Richards. While the references are few, they do show that at least by the 1840s, Joseph was somewhat directly acquainted with the works of Josephus. Now here I'm going to have to summarize because I have about 35 pages of comparison. I'm just going to give you a small sampling of this. But let me begin with the very first verse of the Bible. This is very interesting here. So what I've included at the top is the Septuagint version, the Greek version of the first verse of the Bible. So in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And what I have in red there is this word epoiesan, which just means made. Well, when you go down to Josephus's retelling of this, he actually changes that verb, and that's very significant. In fact, he changes to the word katisdo, which actually doesn't mean made, but it actually means, and I've given my own translation here of this, it actually means fashioned. God didn't make the earth, he fashioned the earth. What's interesting is when Josephus goes on, when he talks about fashioning Adam and Eve out of the dust of the earth, in fact, in Josephus, it's Adam and Zoe, not Adam and Eve, he actually does this, uses this very same verb. What's interesting here, of course, when you go to the book of Abraham, it talks about, well, God didn't, create the earth, he organized the earth, he fashions it. And so, in fact, you find a parallel here between what Josephus is saying and Joseph Smith is saying. Again, you'll find this, of course, elaborated more by Joseph in the King Follett Discourse. What's interesting, though, is this, is that in every single English translation of Josephus, including Whiston's, they miss this nuance. In fact, what Whiston does, and what everyone who preceded him, will harmonize this to the Bible. In fact, it's not going to be until a 1920 edition by Henry Thackeray that he'll actually note saying, Josephus is not actually saying creatio ex nihilo, he's saying creatio ex aliquo, or creation from something. And so this is interesting here that it clearly wouldn't have been derived from the English. So it was an interesting parallel that I thought that I should mention, although clearly it could not have been derived from the English of Josephus. Now let me just say a few things about some early chapters of Genesis. And here I will just be fairly cursory in this. What I think ought to be stressed here is that, in fact, when one begins to compare the treatments of the Bible, Josephus and Joseph Smith's, it becomes very clear they're marked far more by difference than by similarity. For any general parallel you might have, in fact, there's dozens and dozens of differences. So, for example, when you look at how Joseph Smith reworks some of the early chapters of Genesis, Satan plays a very prominent role. However, when you go to Josephus' narrative, he totally expunges Satan, even from the Garden of Eden. It's not actually mentioned, believe it or not. And so you can see here a difference here, and it goes what they're doing here with the text, which is kind of interesting. What goes on also as you move along? For example, both Josephus and Joseph Smith say a lot of extra biblical material about the curse of Cain. But they both do it in very different ways. There's no parallel to be drawn between them. Although I did find one general parallel here between Josephus and Joseph Smith. When Cain's expelled, it says Cain's expelled, and he goes off and he takes a wife and he marries, and he has children. Of course, the problem is, who's Cain actually marrying? You have to assume, to take the biblical literally, he's marrying his mother. And what's interesting is Josephus will actually say, well, in fact, Adam and Eve had other children, and so he's marrying another daughter. What's interesting, too, is that when you go to the JST, it also says that, of course, Adam and Eve had other children, and Cain then goes and marries another daughter of Adam and Eve. I should point out, by the way, Josephus is not the only one in antiquity to say this. In fact, most biblical commentators on antiquity are struck by this and say they're clearly are children of Adam and Eve. But again, here is a parallel of sorts between the two. What's interesting is when you go to Genesis 5, you get the ages of the patriarchs. And what I found interesting is that Josephus will often change the ages of the patriarchs from what you get in the biblical text. And in the JST, it will often change the age from the patriarchs in different editions of the JST. What I found interesting is that there's never one place where Josephus and Joseph Smith agree against the biblical text. I mean, they have a unique number that doesn't appear in the Bible. Whenever they agree, it's always in the Bible, and that seems to be the mediating text there. Now, moving into Genesis 6. And again, there's much more I could say here, but I'm trying to restrict myself to just a few points. This is an interesting point. In Genesis 6, you have these sons of God who come down, and they consort with women, and then they have these children who are giants. Well, Josephus expands this and talks about how these sons of God are, in fact, angels that come down from heaven. They see these women who are very attractive. They come down, assume bodies, and have offspring. So this is how he takes the biblical narrative here. What Joseph Smith does in Moses, anyway, is he will actually take the word sons of God not to refer to angels, but people who are in the covenant. They're clearly mortals here. He wants to make this point. And in fact, he reconfigured it so it's the daughters of the righteous sons who forsook the covenant and married non-believing men. Why I think this is important here is because in George Laub's journal, he actually makes the statement that Joseph Smith commented on this in a discourse given April 13th, 1843. And he said, this is what Joseph said. He says, now the history of Josephus, in speaking of angels, came down and took themselves wives of the daughters of men. See Genesis 6, 1-2. These were resurrected bodies. They violated the celestial laws. I find this very confusing to some degree because if this is taken correctly, it seems that Joseph Smith mentions in Moses in one way, now changes his mind later on. Why I even doubt this further is what Laub's account. I think he mentions Josephus. I think Laub somehow has missed a nuance here because 3 days later, Willard Richards remarks how Joseph will give a sermon on resurrection and made it very clear it only happened after Christ. So in other words, you have to assume that Joseph had one opinion on this passage, changed his mind on April 13th, then changed yet again 3 days later. And so I'm inclined to think here that Laub, while Joseph Smith mentioned Josephus, the way that Laub constructs this in his journal seems to be something strange is going on here in light of what we have in Moses and also in Willard Richards. Let me say a couple of words about Abraham. And I'll return here and I'll read from my paper here. While Josephus and Joseph Smith will both enhance the presentation of Abraham or Abraham with extra biblical additions, they tend to differ far more than they agree. Following the terse biblical account, Josephus introduces the figure of Abraham in the context of relating Shem's posterity. And as soon as he is introduced, he is leaving with certain family members for the land of Canaan. On the other hand, when the book of Abraham introduces Abraham or Abram, it contains a lengthy extra-biblical account for which there is no parallel in Josephus of how Abraham was miraculously saved from the Lord by being sacrificed to idols. Whereas the Bible gives no reason why Abraham left Ur of Chaldea, Josephus adds he left because he was driven out by his kinsfolk. While in the book of Abraham, Abraham left because God directly commanded him to do so. When Abraham leaves Canaan for Egypt, Josephus follows the biblical narrative and relates that Abraham instructed his wife to tell the Egyptians that she was his sister and not his wife, lest they seek to kill him because of her beauty. In the book of Abraham, however, it is the Lord who warns Abraham about the Egyptians and instructs him to tell his wife that she is his sister, lest he be killed. During Abraham's sojourn in Egypt, the episode that has garnered the most attention with respect to parallels between Joseph Smith and Josephus has to do with Abraham instructing Pharaoh regarding the principles of astronomy. In the biblical account, there is no mention that Abraham ever instructed Pharaoh in astronomy, or Pharaoh's court. But Josephus relates that during his sojourn in Egypt, Abraham impressed the Egyptians with his knowledge of mathematics as well as astronomy. The book of Abraham also reports that Abraham knew astronomy. And while there is certainly a distinct parallel here between Josephus and Joseph Smith, it also needs to be pointed out there are some key differences in the way they present Abraham teaching astronomy. First off, whereas the book of Abraham relates the principles of astronomy were given to Abraham in a nighttime revelation before he entered Egypt, Josephus reports that Abraham had already acquired such knowledge while still in Chaldea, and that he had acquired this through celestial observation, because he was a natural prodigy and a wise man. Second, Josephus frames Abraham's presentation of astronomical insights within the context of mathematics, whereas in the book of Abraham it never reports that Abraham taught mathematics, but taught the Egyptians astronomy, or this is implied anyway, in Facsimile 3, that teach the realities of monotheism. Finally, in Josephus' account, Pharaoh is never mentioned, and the context presupposed that Abraham taught generally the Egyptians arithmetic and astronomy, whereas the book of Abraham, again, Facsimile 3, implies that Abraham taught Pharaoh specifically astronomy. In this respect, this later point here, the book of Abraham account is actually closer, this is what I found very interesting, to an account given by Artapanus, an ancient Jewish author who lived in Egypt sometime before the 1st century BC, since he specifically reported that Abraham taught Pharaoh astronomy in his court. In fact, Artapanus is only preserved in a later Christian historian Eusebius, and in a work by Eusebius called Preparatio Evangelica, and this work will not be translated in English. It will first occur in 1903. I should point out also that there will be other Jewish authors. Philo of Alexandria will also comment on Abraham knowing astronomy. And in fact, Philo will actually talk, not in this context, but in terms of how light circulates in the universe, has some interesting parallels here between Abraham 3, 5 to 8, 12 to 13. But again, the first time Philo is translated into English is Young's translation of 1854. Let me say a couple words about Moses and then the Book of Mormon. Again, I could talk about Melchizedek or Joseph in Egypt, but let me just say a couple words here. Moses is a very important figure for Josephus. He is the lawgiver, and so he presents him in a very particular way. He will often excise any story that makes Moses look bad, but he also then he emphasizes aspects that make Moses look really well. So he depicts Moses more or less as a wise general. In fact, he tells a story that Moses, apparently as an Egyptian general, led forces down into Egypt. This, of course, is not in the Bible. When you go to Joseph Smith's treatment of Moses, especially the extra-biblical treatment of this, there's no mention of him being a general, but it really focuses on him being a prophet, receiving revelation, which is two different presentations of Moses. Now, there's a number of differences, but I did find two kind of general similarities between the two. When Josephus treats Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, or these 10 plagues, Josephus makes it clear that, in fact, it's not the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart, but Pharaoh was just a stubborn person and kept doing this. For Josephus, he found this posed a problem to divine theodicy. Interestingly enough, when you go to the JST, the same thing occurs. It's not the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart, but in fact, he does this of his own accord. The second thing, which is interesting, is that Josephus reports at the end of Moses' life, and he says, although it may say in the Bible he dies, in fact, he was taken up to God. A cloud overtook him, and he returned to the Lord. Interesting, again, when you look in Deuteronomy, the Lord buried him, but in fact, the JST, the Lord took Moses unto the fathers, and again, this is then expanded in Alma 45:19. But again, I should point out that, in fact, Josephus is not the only person in antiquity to say this. You will find this in some extra-biblical treatises, for example. We don't have it, but the Assumption of Moses will also mention this. Let me say something here about the Book of Mormon just for a moment, going beyond the Bible. If I were to look at perhaps some very general thematic similarities, and this would then go to Josephus' Jewish War. As he narrates this war against the Romans, what will ultimately lead to the decline and the destruction of the temple in AD 70, he talks about what are the conditions that led to this decline. And there's various factors: Roman mismanagement, Jewish sensibilities. But one of the things he really blames in this whole narrative is, in fact, he says, well, these groups of robbers became very prominent. As society declined, robbers began emerging in the countryside, sacking villages, towns, roads, and communication broke down. So robbers are blamed for destruction of this society. When you go to the Book of Mormon, again, you might find a general parallel in terms of the Gadianton robbers being blamed to some degree for the destruction here of society. Now let me get to this picture that some of you are looking at and see pointing. At least in the Middle Ages, the most quoted story of Josephus by Christians is not his mention of Jesus, or his mention of John the Baptist, or his mention of James, the brothers of Jesus, but it's this story here, that in the final weeks of the siege of Jerusalem, things got so bad that, in fact, a woman there resorted to cannibalism within the city. In fact, she saw that it was only a matter of time before the Romans would breach the walls. People were starving, and so she didn't want a child to be taken and sold in slavery. And being in desperation, she then took her son, killed him, and ate him. And Josephus uses this as a point to say, this is when we know God had truly forsaken the Jewish people. He's gone. It's over. It's interestingly enough, and this is a different context, but when you go to the Book of Mormon, what's the one place in the Book of Mormon that you see that God now has truly forsaken these people? Well, for me, it's in Moroni 9, Mormon's letter to his son Moroni, when he reports that, in fact, they had turned to cannibalism. In fact, people had been taking Lamanite women hostages, sexually assaulting them, and then eating them as a sign of bravery. He says, it's over. It's too late. The civilization is gone. Now, it is very different context here. I want to point this out. But again, there's a thematic similarity. Although what I ought to point out here, too, is, in fact, you do find this in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and even Jeremiah. They're actually warned about this. You will know that God's forsaken you when you start eating people. It's great to sound. We see this here in Josephus. So it's interesting you see this in the book of, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Jeremiah. Let me just end really quickly and summarize a couple things. What's interesting is, again, this passage here with Miriam and here the reference to Jesus stoning of James, this does not occur anywhere in early LDS literature. In fact, this famous passage here, this reference to Jesus, what becomes known as the Testimonium Flavianum, the first LDS writer that actually references this is Orson Pratt in the Journal of Discourses on September 28, 1873. It's quite interesting. And what is different here is, in fact, most Christians who are talking about Josephus at this time spend a lot of time talking about this passage, or the passage referring to James, or the passage referring to John the Baptist. Also, I should mention here, when I did this comparison, I also did a very close kind of textual analysis. And what was nice here, I was able to search digital versions of Josephus, as well as, the standard, works, the JST, Book of Moses, Book of Abraham, and I was never able to find a single word-for-word parallel between the two. And so what would I say then? How does Joseph Smith, how well does he know Josephus? Well, the impression I get is he's certainly aware of him. I'm not convinced at all for a moment that he's a real scholar of Josephus, that knows many details. And based on what I saw earlier on, is when Josephus is mentioned in early writings of Latter-day Saints newspapers, they're often encountering Josephus via a Bible dictionary, a commentary, something like that. This is what I'd be inclined to think, is that perhaps if Joseph Smith does know more about Josephus, it's probably via this, as opposed to him actually sitting down and reading it. And so I could say more, but I think I'm out of time, so I will end there. But thank you.